The last prophecy. The story's end. To save the worlds, there is only one way. Subscribe to Spookydood. Hello everyone, my name is Spookydood, and like the rest of the Deltarune community, I'm quite angry with Susie for shattering that last prophecy panel. Come on, dog, I really wanted to see that. In the ending of Chapter 4, after defeating the Titan, and after already having established that Ralsei doesn't want Susie to see the rest of the prophecy, Susie accidentally ends up reading the ending of the prophecy. To save the worlds, there is only one way, but she shatters the last one before we can read it. Ralsei is distraught as he explains that his entire goal so far seems to be trying to change whatever it is that has to happen. He even says that he thought if we were kind enough, then maybe something would change by the time we got here. But nothing has. Susie laughs it off, though, as she feels it's something so absurdly terrible that we'd obviously never let it happen. She even says to Ralsei, "I wouldn't let it happen, Chris wouldn't let it happen, and obviously you wouldn't let it happen." So, what is it? Well, I'm going to come clean. I don't know. And neither does anyone else. You know, this is not a Five Nights at Freddy's Scooby-Doo secret mystery with the clues lying around. There's no way to 100% solve this. But we can certainly try. This right here is the prophecy board, aka a picture of a corkboard I stole off of Google Images. Go ahead right now and search up "What did the final prophecy say Deltarune" on Google. You'll find several dozen different answers, all somewhat plausible, but this is not interesting. I'd like to come up with a specific answer today by following evidence and making logical conclusions based on the information presented in-game. Is there a chance that I'll make a wrong turn, base my theory on some false assumption early on, and end up incorrect? Sure, but that's the risk that us theorists take. We knew it was part of the job when we signed up. Today, I would like to talk about the final prophecy and try to get as specific as possible as to what it could be foretelling. So with that being said, my name is Spookydood, make sure to like and subscribe, now let's discuss. Very quickly, as I've mentioned in many previous videos, I have a second channel called Spooky Vision that you can subscribe to. I know I said that there would be some content coming there soon, and so far, there is not. But I'm definitely, still have that second channel, so you can go subscribe, Maybe it's a surprise. That's the gimmick. It's a surprise when I upload that first video. Okay, so easy answers out of the way first. The final prophecy says that someone will die. The final prophecy says someone will die with the added element of another one of the characters being the one to kill them. The final prophecy says that the Dark Worlds must be destroyed. These are the very easy answers and the ones that you'll see most often on the internet. I'm not going to necessarily write any of these off, but I think we need to acknowledge two factors here. First off, she says to Ralsei, "You obviously wouldn't let that happen." Considering Ralsei has very little sense of self-worth as established throughout the entirety of the last two chapters, and considering that the entire nature of the Dark Worlds is sort of built on a mysterious magic system that even Susie doesn't fully get, I doubt she'd write off this ending, the ending being that the Dark Worlds have to be destroyed, as a possibility so easily. Ralsei would be fully willing to sacrifice the Dark Worlds forever. He literally tells Tenna to get over himself because his desire for attention is meaningless in the face of the Lighteners simply being more important. Similarly, we know that all this Titan stuff can just happen. To see that the Dark Worlds must be sealed to end the apocalypse and write it off as something that simply won't happen seems pretty hasty. If I was Susie, I would acknowledge that the permanent closure of all Dark Worlds could simply be another world-building magic element that I can't necessarily argue with, in the same way that opening another fountain within a dark fountain spawns a Titan. It could simply be something that must happen, so to write it off as an impossibility would be silly. The second thing that we need to acknowledge is that, while it's not 100% confirmed, one of the most popular prophecy-related theories is that Susie misunderstood the prophecy in the Second Sanctuary. Remember, Susie's Dark World is mixed up and out of order. In the section where we see information about the three heroes, it's heavily implied based on several factors that the girl with hope crossed on her heart is not Susie, it's actually Noel. Susie is not the girl, she's the dragon. There is arguing within the community as to whether the prophecy is meant to speak of two girls, the girl with hope crossed on her heart, and then this other girl, and then there's the girl, which would represent Susie, or if the two mentions of the girl is referencing the same girl. Look, if you feel like you're having a seizure trying to understand what I'm saying here, don't worry about it. My point is, regardless of what you believe here with the prophecy or who the girl is, the theory that the girl with hope crossed on her heart is Noel, wrongfully misinterpreted as Susie, is a very strong one. So then, if the final prophecy does talk of a main character's death, then if the girl is included in this panel, there is a chance that Susie could be reading it wrong. Say the final panel is the girl will be sacrificed. Susie might wrongfully misinterpret this as saying that she will be sacrificed, when in reality it means Noel will be sacrificed. This is just an example to show how complicated and messed up the character's understanding of the final prophecy could be based on what it says. That's my whole point. I'm not trying to come to any conclusions just yet, just that if it's true that the prophecy is being misread by Susie, then the final prophecy also could be misinterpreted. So then, understanding that it is not a simple answer, let's go through everything regarding this final prophecy. I believe the seeds of the tragedy ahead were planted since the very beginning of the game. Right after seeing this final prophecy, Ralsei says something interesting. As I previously explained, he says, "I thought if I said something different, if I did something different, if we were just kind enough, perhaps by the time we got here, it would change." The line that is most interesting to me is that last one, "if we were just kind enough." Now this is really interesting to me because in so many of my previous videos, I spoke about Ralsei's weird dialogue in Chapter 1, and the numerous times he told us the importance of being kind. I think there's a little more to this story. Let's take a look at what specifically he says in Chapter 1. The first time he talks about the importance of being kind is right before we exit Castletown through the Great Door. He says, "Chris, once we pass through this door, our adventure will really begin. A journey foretold exactly by the prophecy. But Chris, I believe your choices are important too. This world is full of all kinds of people, Chris. In the end, how we treat them makes all the difference. So let's try our best to get by without fighting. If we can manage to do that, I believe this tale may have a happy ending. Otherwise, I fear that you may not find the result favorable." This is a pretty understandable request. As we've already established, Ralsei thought that if we were kind enough, we could change the ending of the story. This does tell us a few things about the final prophecy, though. I think with this dialogue we can firmly debunk the idea that the final prophecy relates to the permanent banishment of all Dark Worlds. Think for a second. Ralsei said that he thought if we had been kinder, maybe we could have changed the ending. He also says, let's try our best to get by without fighting. If we can manage to do that, I believe the tale may have a happy ending. By combining these two instances, we can figure out that the final prophecy panel is a result we may not find favorable, aka an unhappy ending. Whatever it is that is foretold by that final panel is a bad ending to the story, like an objectively bad ending. This is backed up by Sham, who has knowledge of the future, basically saying that the future cannot be changed, and also implies that the future in question is a bad one. The whole theme of your choices don't matter seems to be specifically in relation to this idea, that the ending is going to be bad. Gerson's whole character arc was about inspiring Susie with hope that she can change the future. The final few prophecy panels even refer to the very last prophecy as the final tragedy, which will be unveiled. So all this is to say, one quality of the final prophecy panel is that it is an objectively bad ending that we would want to change. Something as simple as closing the Dark Worlds doesn't seem to be a tragedy, because if it saves the world, there is no sense of loss here. Therefore, I think that the final prophecy panel being a tragedy, being that something Ralsei wants to subvert, it's not as simple as the Dark Worlds must be banished away. That doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? Ralsei wouldn't fight that. If that's how to save the worlds, Ralsei would accept that. But if there was some sense of tangible loss, probably in the Light World, then that makes more sense with, calling this a tragedy. Now, there are those among us who would consider the permanent closure of all Dark Worlds and the eternal silence of Ralsei to be a bad ending. But I don't think Ralsei is one of those people. Ralsei has already made it clear to us that he has no sense of self-worth. Everything he does is in service of the Lighteners. I highly doubt this bad ending he's trying to subvert is his own death. He literally tells Tenna, yeah, time's up, buddy, with Susie being the one who tells Ralsei that mindset is wrong. So on to my next question. Why was Ralsei so set on the idea that being kind might be what stops the prophecy from happening? I'm actually going to stick this onto the board as a piece of evidence. Remember, with how little we have, every bit about the final prophecy is important. While it ultimately seems to be untrue, it is somewhat believable that being kind could possibly alter the final prophecy. That is another factor of it. So what could it be? Well, just as an example, I'm not honestly suggesting this, just using it as an example, but it could be something as simple as the Titans destroy everything, with Ralsei believing that if we were kind enough, maybe we'd befriend them rather than fight them. On the flip side, something like the Light World residents will lose all their memories doesn't make much sense now, seeing as it makes no logical sense to believe that being kind would change that in any way. Again, these are just examples. I don't actually think it has anything to do with, Titans or mass memory loss. I'm just saying you have to factor in the kindness angle to figuring out what it is. You couldn't stop some magic, force by being kind, but if it was an enemy or a character that does something, maybe kindness could stop them from doing that. You know what I'm saying? So I'd like to throw out an idea here. What if, knowing that Rousey believes being kind could change it, the final prophecy revolves around a certain character doing something bad to something or someone else? If Rousey believed that kindness can change the outcome, kindness only inspires change in other people. Some larger-than-life force, like I previously said, wouldn't be stopped by kindness. So then, we should keep in mind that it's likely the final prophecy revolves around the actions of one character in particular. The next time Rousey brings up kindness is when talking to Chris about Susie, also in Chapter 1. He says, "Perhaps I shouldn't have been so hard on her, but I just worry that if Susie is too eager to fight, then... Well, let's just be kind to her, okay, Chris? I'm sure Susie will come around soon." This is really interesting. You see, regardless of whether or not we've been kind, or if we fight or spare or whatever, Susie's actions don't really change regardless. Rousey, though, is specifically worried about Susie's eagerness to fight. Now, there are two potential readings here. Either A, Rousey is worried about the entire team's willingness to fight, and Susie at that point is the only one who refuses to be a pacifist, or B, there's something important about Susie being kind specifically. While I think the logical reading of this is probably the first way, that Rousey just wants the fun gang in general to be kind, I do think it's interesting that Susie is the one character with the ability to change fate. Rousey believing that her kindness is most important isn't totally out of the realm of possibility. The reason I bring this up is to raise a question. Considering it seems possible or even likely that the final prophecy revolves around a character doing something, could it be that Susie is the one who's going to do whatever the final prophecy states? Consider for one moment. Susie is the only one whose actions so far have the ability to break the game's whole choices not mattering thing. Susie has been told that she has the power to write the future, specifically her. The final prophecy panel is also so upsetting to Susie that she punches it, cutting her hand. Obviously she writes it off as silly, but I don't think she'd do something so extreme unless it invoked a strong emotional reaction out of her. So perhaps the final prophecy states that Susie is going to do something drastic, something that would cause the ending to be considered bad. Rousey actually has another line of dialogue that could indicate this is true. When talking about the prophecy, Rousey tells Susie that everything it states will come to pass, and that it can literally predict the future. Susie asks, "There, aren't anywhere I do anything cool, right?" Rousey replies awkwardly, We know that Rousey's entire deal this chapter is that he's afraid of Susie seeing too much, specifically the final prophecy panel. This dialogue makes me wonder, is it possibly referencing the final panel? Rousey is very much preoccupied with making sure Susie is happy and taken care of. In Chapter 3, he talks to us about going to the festival with her, and making sure she has a good time. He wants to make sure she's not lonely. So then, our first solid idea as to where the final prophecy is going, it's a tragedy that specifically relates to the actions of a specific character, possibly Susie. There's two things I'd like to establish really quick. First off, one more piece of evidence pointing to the final prophecy being a character action rather than defeat at the hands of some villain or a world-ending force. Susie says, "I wouldn't let that happen, Chris wouldn't let that happen, etc." They couldn't beat the Knight, so I doubt Susie would laugh off a warning of an impossible enemy ahead. Like if it said, "The heroes will fall to the Knight," or "The heroes must die to the Titans." I don't think Susie would laugh that off or be like, "Yeah, we wouldn't let that happen," because they could not defeat the Knight. So that would be a very ominous and threatening thing. And Susie's laughter, it makes me feel personally like there's some sort of absurdity to the final prophecy beyond, some doom and gloom fact, like you're gonna die, buddy. It's like, Rousey will rip everyone's eyes out. It's like, oh yeah, okay, like that's gonna happen. That's the way I feel like that reading, from Chapter 4. That's how Susie comes across. Instead, by saying they wouldn't let it happen, it seems more to be something that is easily stoppable or something that sounds out of character or unbelievable for the character in question to do. Hence why Susie feels like none of them would ever let something like it happen. But let's put a pin in that for a moment, because there's some other information to digest. The final prophecy is something that specifically Rousey would be interested in stopping. This is sort of a loose idea, and I'm not 100% sold on it just yet, but when talking about it, Susie says, "I wouldn't let it happen, Chris wouldn't let it happen, you obviously wouldn't let it happen." Why put so much emphasis on Rousey obviously not letting it happen? I've seen many suggest, again, that it's because he dies or the Dark Worlds are destroyed. This, again, doesn't make sense considering the plushie from Chapter 2 caused his first selfish desire. He doesn't seem like he's been trying to avoid his own death since Chapter 1. If death was required to save the Light Worlds, he'd 100% be willing to do it. And I believe that he'd probably be willing to sacrifice the Dark Worlds as well. There's another problem with this. The prophecy doesn't say to save the world there is only one way, it says to save the worlds there is only one way. And after the Shattered Prophecy, only then will the worlds be saved. Worlds, plural. So destroying or permanently closing all Dark Worlds doesn't necessarily make sense. So what else could it be? Well, I've seen some suggest that it could be slightly different than the destruction of the Dark Worlds. Instead, it states that the Light and Dark Worlds need to be separated permanently, inaccessible from one another. Now, there actually is some merit to this idea. Remember, Rousey has spent quite a while making sure that Susie is happy and taken care of. As much as his comments about taking Susie to the festival make total sense at face value, he feels sorry that he can't be there for her in the real world and therefore wants to make sure she's not lonely, you do have to wonder if perhaps the reason he's trying to fix Susie's outside life is because at some point he won't be there anymore at all. Combine this with two moments from Chapter 4. First, when talking with Gerson about how she'd write the ending, Susie said she'd never end it. She specifically says it's just better off if stuff just goes on forever, right? At the end of Chapter 4, just before sealing the fountain, after seeing the final panel, Susie says she wants tomorrow to be the same as yesterday, and the day after that, and the day after that, so that we can always go back to the way things were before. So then, it could stand to reason that the final prophecy is the separation of the two worlds. The only way for them to be saved is for them to be apart forever. Now, this does technically make sense, but also, I don't like it. I get that this is just my opinion, but it just doesn't really seem like it makes sense. Again, Rousey would let that happen if it was going to save the Light World, and I think Susie would be willing to let that happen too if it was the only way to save everyone. I know the idea that Susie doesn't want these adventures to end is a pretty simple, believable arc for her to have, but Susie's not selfish, and I don't think she'd be willing to risk the safety of both worlds to continue going on adventures. And that doesn't really seem to me like a tragedy, you know what I mean? Also, how exactly would separating the Light and Dark Worlds save both worlds? The Dark Worlds are sort of a bent reflection of the Light Worlds. It is heavily implied that without the Light Worlds, the Dark Worlds wouldn't exist. I don't think they could exist by being permanently separated. Also, this is considered a tragedy, which implies some kind of monumental loss. Separating the worlds permanently would be bittersweet, sure, but it is not a tragedy. So where does that leave us? Well, before we continue, I'd like to bring up another interaction regarding this prophecy. At the very, very end of Chapter 4, standing outside Chris's window, Susie says, "We aren't going to let that happen." Right? Immediately following this, Chris stands up on their windowsill like some kind of daredevil freak before someone calls them on the phone, saying, "Don't forget, Chris, you promised." I can't help but think that this phone call is in direct contrast to Susie's dialogue here. We're not going to let that happen, right, Chris? With the answer to that question coming from the implication that yes, they are going to let that happen because it's part of Carol's plan. This is the thing. Don't let the thing happen, only for it to happen no matter how odd it seems, is a very well-established trope. It seems right now to Susie that whatever it is will not specifically happen because the three party members don't want it to happen. Rousey is obviously against it happening whatever it is, as his entire deal with kindness, as we previously stated, is to try and change the outcome. Susie laughs at it and wants to make sure there's no way it's going to happen, which just leaves Chris, the character who just so happens to be working behind the fun gang's back. Say what you will about how innocent Chris is, the fact of the matter is that Chris is working alongside the being that nearly ended the world, the Roaring Knight, which Susie desperately wants to stop. If Susie found out Chris was working with them, the entire foundation of the team would be destroyed, as I have a hard time believing she'd ever trust Chris again. I understand that some of you would probably say that this just sounds out of character for Chris, but you know the whole Chris slash theory? The theory that it was Chris who slashed Susie and Rousey at the end of the Knight fight in Chapter 3, not the Knight. Now, I understand if you don't believe that theory. Personally, I think there is some merit to it, but I'm not 100% sold. Regardless of whether or not you believe it, the fact of the matter is that Chris's plan was for this to happen. Regardless of if they slashed Susie and Rousey, or if it was the Knight, Chris understood that they had to lose that fight. Chris, coughs and shakes their head a little bit, as if to give the Knight the signal that you gotta end this fight, buddy. Even if they don't want to hurt Susie and Rousey, which, we know to be true from that minigame, it is true that they were willing to go through with this, getting knocked down by the Knight, as part of their plan. So whether or not they slashed them, it was still expected to happen. They still knew it was going to happen. So they are still partially responsible for it. That's what I'm saying. You know, Chris is not as innocent as some people make them out to be. And while, you know, they're definitely not in the wrong for the situation being possessed by us and or the Snowgrave route or anything like that, they are still going to some pretty far extremes, seemingly, to have Carol's plan happen. Back to what I was saying before, if Susie found out that Chris was working with Carol in the night, the entire foundation of the team would be destroyed, as I have a hard time believing she'd ever trust Chris again. The reason I say this is because Susie doesn't think this will happen based on her and Ralsei's outwardly stated opinions, but she's only assuming Chris's opinions on the final prophecy, without realizing that they have a much larger plan going on behind the scenes. So then, is Chris the one who will bring about the final prophecy? Personally, with everything we know, I think this is the most likely. If the final prophecy is truly a tragedy, with something actually being lost, even if Susie feels betrayed or hurt, I do not think she'd be the one to bring about a tragedy. Ralsei obviously wouldn't do it either. Chris, though, might. They were willing to open the Chapter 3 fountain, work with the Knight, stop Susie from seeing the guitar code, and more. Susie and Chris's quest to enter the shelter in Chapter 4 is a completely fake one. Chris is not intending to let Susie into the shelter whatsoever. So then, I think it's safe to say that out of all the characters, Chris is the most likely one to bring about whatever the final prophecy states, with Susie as the runner-up. The reason I still think Susie might be the one to do it is because while it definitely seems like Susie has the ability to change the future and rewrite fate, it also is rare for a story about an inevitable end that cannot be avoided to just subvert the ending without it happening once. Like, typically in a time loop movie or something, we see the bad ending over and over, establishing the terribleness of it in our minds before it's subverted. We're hurtling towards that ending, and on the main story, not the weird route, Gerson is talking about how we might be able to change that ending. Add on to that the Scooby-Doo rule. Okay, so I'll script for a second. The Scooby-Doo rule is in every episode of Scooby-Doo, they catch the villains, right? But they either catch them, or, you know, how do you know if they're going to catch the villain or not? Well, there is an online rule that says that if they say, alright gang, I've got a plan, and then they don't hear the plan, well then it's going to work, because explaining the plan to the audience and then seeing it work is not interesting. There has to be some level of suspense. So if they explain the plan in detail, it's not going to work. If they don't explain the plan, it works. And I mean, it's based on, I don't have it off the top of my head, I'm sure I'm going to sound crazy, but it's based on like basic writing logic, where it's like, kind of like, you know, I don't know if I'd say Chekhov's gun word, but it's just like, if I told you, you know, I'm going to the store, I sure don't hope that something bad doesn't happen, something bad's gonna happen. You know, that's just the rules of writing it. Writing stuff. So if you're like writing, oh, here's the plan, gang, we're gonna catch that guy in a net. Well, you're basically saying, here's our plan, I sure hope it doesn't go wrong. So like, you're setting it up, you know what I mean? I don't know. Anyway. My point of this being, we didn't see the final prophecy. And in the ending of Chapter 4, when Susie talks to Chris before saying, we're not going to let that happen, right? She says something else, something we don't see. I believe this was telling Chris what happened in the final prophecy. The reason we, the player, don't see it is to keep it a surprise until close to the very end. Because it will happen. As per the Scooby-Doo rule, keeping it hidden from us is a way to kind of keep the mystery up in the air while letting us know it is a tragedy, so there is, you know, we do want to avoid it, but we don't know exactly what it is because it's going to happen. Is it possible that on the main storyline, come Chapter 7, we'll reach that point in the story and just subvert it? That the main story of Deltarune is about a terrible tragedy that Susie avoids with the power of hope? Sure, but I'm way more inclined to think that, while that will happen, it'll only be through meta shenanigans outside the linear framework of the chapters. After all, why include the shadow crystals? Or have Ralsei imply that our goal on the weird route is still to change the future, unless that original future has to happen? Personally, I think the terrible tragedy will happen. So why do I think Susie is still the possible culprit? Well, Susie does have the white pen of hope. She is the one whose choices matter the most. So if that's true, then the final prophecy will come to pass by her hand. If she has the power to subvert it, then that ending happening will most likely be caused by her own hand. Otherwise, why would it happen? Susie having the power to change the future is sort of the ultimate weapon in this story, so the only way it doesn't end up working is if her power to decide the future ends with her making the decision that causes the final tragedy to unfold as prophesized. One more thing about Chris. You might find it pretty crazy that I'm suggesting there's some terrible tragedy that could involve the death of a major character that Chris would willingly carry out. I don't think any of us actually expect Chris to be an antagonist. I mean, come on. No matter how serious their whole truth becomes regarding their deeper plans, at the end of the day, there's going to be a moment where everyone goes, "Oh, I understand why you do that, Chris. Let's be friends, we're here for you, Omori, 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 etc." I imagine that this moment would happen after the tragic backstory is revealed. If it's true that they caused the disappearance or death of December, then going to extremes to get her back seems like something they would do. Also, one more thing. Chris is implied to want to subvert the Final Prophecy panel as well. One of the through lines with the Shadow Crystal quest is that Spamton, Eram, and Sham all seem to think Chris is searching for freedom. Sham seems to imply that the Shadow Crystals in Chris's search for them is because they're looking for some other future. Their whole deal, Sham is that they believe the future is preordained, and it's the end of the world, that they cannot be. However, as we gather the Shadow Crystals, they seem to be slowly inspired and filled with hope. Spamton also implies that Chris was looking for freedom. I'm not going to go through every line of dialogue because it involves like 10 minutes of Spamton translation, but just go watch anyone else and they'll back this idea up. Besides, the most important thing is Eram, who not only implies Chris is searching for the Shadow Crystals, but also says something about why. Chris, oh Chris, isn't it fun, Chris, playing around like this? That's why you're searching for them, aren't you? The Shadow Crystals and the Shadow Mantle that I'm holding. Do you honestly think it'll get you what you want? No, part of you is just enjoying this, isn't it? The same part of you that enjoyed yesterday, knowing that you could say it wasn't really you. Yes, that last bit is only accessible on the weird route, but the rest is on both routes. Eram implies that the reason Chris is looking for the Shadow Crystals is because it's fun to play around like this. But how do these two things correlate? Why would their search for the crystals be at all inspired by their enjoyment of the Dark Worlds? What is it that they want? Simple freedom or something else? Well, while I think there's a lot more to this, we just don't have enough information to truly say. That being said, no matter what it is, I do think Chris wants to change that Final Prophecy panel. When you look through the Shadow Crystal in front of it, it says, "For some strange reason, no matter how you look, the prophecy's text does not warp in the crystal's lens. You shook the crystal, however, nothing changed." So Chris wants the Final Prophecy to change, and maybe they think the Shadow Crystals will be able to alter it. I wonder, though, why look through the Shadow Crystal at the prophecy? We don't actually know what it does yet, but Chris seems to think that looking through it will reveal an altered prophecy. Does this mean that the Shadow Crystals show something that'll happen, show a possible alternate future? Who knows? Now let's quickly talk about Noel. I know, she doesn't really fit into this discussion we're having at all, but that's not going to stop me from talking about her. Two things need to be discussed here. First off, the potential that this Final Prophecy and the characters' reactions to it cannot be used to accurately determine what it is because they misunderstand who it's about. Okay, I've tried to write the next paragraph a billion times, but it just sounds so delusional and 30 levels of thinking deep, so I'm just going to off-script simplify it. Back to what I said before, one of the big theories is that in the second Dark World, Susie sees the girl with hope crossed on her heart, and she says, "Oh, that's me." But in reality, it's meant to be Noel. There's been some sort of alteration to the prophecy, maybe the new future, all that stuff, and in truth, Susie's not a hero of the prophecy, Noel is. Therefore, anything that this Final Prophecy says is under question because if it involves the girl, Susie might be thinking it means her, but it means Noel. So if Susie says we're obviously not going to let it happen, maybe Noel being the real one it's talking about could mean, oh, it could happen. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because all that it would end up meaning is that instead of Susie in the prophecy, Noel would be there instead. And pretty much everything I said about Susie or Chris or whatever, it also applies to Noel. I don't think Noel would willingly kill anyone. I don't think Noel would willingly bring about a tragedy. I think that, Noel has her whole sort of weird trance, confusion state in the Snowgrave route. And so it's like, well, technically, there could always be something like she sees December and she confusingly steps up to the angel's heaven and stops us from banishing it, and oh no, but that's so specific that there'd be no reason to even bother talking about it, because I come on. So either way, it doesn't really matter. Back to the script. So as you see, regardless of who it is really about, the reactions of the characters don't really change, because at the very most, it'd be X kills Y, but the identity of Y is undecided between Susie and Noel, so it doesn't matter. You don't have to think about that. So, moving on from that whole thing, if the prophecy is about Noel, considering her role ends at love finds its way to the girl, there's really nothing we can tell about this just yet. There's only one other potential piece of evidence we can gather here. Some of the prophecy rhymes. The first few lines of the prophecy all rhyme. A world basked in purest light, beneath it grew eternal night. If fountains freed the roaring cries, and titans shape from darkened eyes, the light and dark both burning dire, a countdown to the earth's expire, etc., etc., etc. And there are other bits later in the prophecy like this too. They'll hear the ring of heaven's call, they'll see the tail of hell take crawl. The knight which makes with blackened knife shall duel with heroes strife by strife. So then, is it possible that the ending of the prophecy also rhymes? Well, it kind of seems to start out that way. Then when all hope is lost for the tale, the final tragedy unveils. To save the world there is only one way, then the final prophecy. So is it possible that it ends in a word ending with A? I get this is a stretch because, like I said, not all the prophecy rhymes, but it definitely seems like it was being set up to rhyme there, right? To save the worlds there is only one way. The prince must be locked away, their memories must be wiped away, history must be wiped away. So this is sort of a dead end. All we can do now is sit down in our thinking chair and try and figure this out. We know that no matter what it is, the final prophecy most likely involves the actions of one character, as it is something that is likely able to be stopped, or more so something that seems unlikely for any of our characters to do. It is also a tragedy, something explicitly bad carrying with it a sense of loss. It also likely involves something that Rousey specifically wouldn't let happen, so it most likely has to do with the light world. It's also something that, even if Chris is the one to bring it about, they want to stop it, which is why they're searching for the crystals. So then, what could it be? Well, understand my guess will not be perfect. It is simply what I think based on what we know, and even if it's ultimately false, it could be partially true. And finally, what I believe the final prophecy will be. There is one more thing I failed to mention. The ending of the prophecy will most likely involve what Rousey says happens at the end of his version of the prophecy. The earth will draw her final breath. Only then, shining with hope, 3 heroes appear at world's edge. Only they can seal the fountains and banish the angels' heaven. Only then will balance be restored and the world saved from destruction. While Rousey's prophecy was not exact, it was mostly correct, and it seemingly involves banishing the angels' heaven as the final step to save the world. Who exactly is the angel? Well, while there are several fair answers, and Gaster Angel has certainly become a little bit more interesting, I think chapters 3 and 4 gave us our best answer. Us. We are the angel, and we need to be banished. So what's the final prophecy? The girl will shatter the cage. The best part about this guess is that it'll happen on both routes. The relevance of the human soul was questioned by Susie after banishing the Titan. She calls it that heart thing. Before she can ask more about it, she quickly runs ahead to try and find Gerson. If it's true that we are the angel and we need to be banished, then Chris being called the cage makes perfect sense. They are a temporary holding space for us. And in the end of the story, we need to be set free. But this can only happen if Chris allows us to. However, they need us. Okay, let me start from the beginning here. Originally, we were meant to be the vessel, seemingly intended by Gaster. If my theory is correct and the story ends with the cage getting shattered, then perhaps Gaster isn't such a bad guy. This was his way of allowing the prophecy to be acted out without killing someone. A soulless cage, literally a cage, intended to carry us to the end. However, we were then interrupted by someone, possibly someone in the Donkey Kong country. Get it? Because DKC, Chris, Carol. Okay. Anyways, now we're in Chris, because Carol's plan requires us to be around. So Chris is grimly marching towards their set destination, knowing that the ending of the prophecy states that the girl will shatter the cage. This is why they want to stop it, because they obviously don't want to die, and it's why Eram says they're searching for the shadow crystals. Chris's depressed nature and what many have called self-harm-related imagery is not accidental. They feel such immense guilt for whatever it is they did that they're willing to carry out this mission with the knowledge that they might die. Could Carol have a plan to save Chris at the last moment? To change things so that they don't die in the ending of the story as is expected? Sure, but it seems highly unlikely that this will happen. We see that Chris even shakes the shadow crystal in front of the prophecy to no avail. This is also why Susie refuses to believe something like this could happen, but why it probably will end up happening. If Chris fights against the banishing of the angel's heaven at the last minute, or is instead interested in finding some way to bring Des back, even if that means not saving the world, Susie will not accept that whatsoever. If Susie finds out Chris is working with the Knight, she'd be mad but will ultimately get over it. If she finds out at the moment of saving the world that Chris has been working with the Knight and is now fighting against banishing the Angel's Heaven, even though the truth about the Knight's identity could technically explain why they're doing it, it'll certainly seem like a complete betrayal of the team and their trust. And if Chris is truly willing to die for December, willing to die to undo whatever it is they did, then a final fight here makes perfect sense. Remember how we've all been saying versus Susie sounds like an excerpt, and we'll probably get a second version? Some have even suggested it's going to be a versus Susie version of Megalovania. Well, I imagine that'll play right here. And on the weird route? Well, considering we'd likely be playing as Noel by this point, if Chris got in our way here, well, the girl would certainly shatter the cage. Susie obviously wouldn't let that happen. Chris obviously wouldn't let it happen. Rouse obviously wouldn't let it happen, seeing how much he cares for everyone. But what happens when everything Susie thinks she knows isn't true? What happens when Chris isn't even Chris? When the thing she's made friends with isn't Chris, but some otherworldly being controlling their body? And the person she thought was her friend has actually been working with the Knight the entire time. So, that's that. That's my theory as to what the final prophecy states. The girl will shatter the cage. Susie is going to have to fight and probably kill Chris. Do I think it's going to happen? I think that there's a strong possibility that it could happen with, all of these sort of interwoven storylines coming together at the end point. The reveal that Chris, what Chris did at why they're doing this, all coming, at this one big point where, there's a big final fight. Susie's like, are you kidding me? You're working with the Knight this whole time, and you don't want to save the worlds, and all of this was, now I understand why the prophecy says that, and, you're the one who did this and that and the other thing, and, that's it. It's over, buddy. You're done. I think that, that's what I think, and I think it's going to hurt because of how often Susie has talked about her friendship with Chris and how much it means to her. There's that line in, I think, Chapter 3, where she says, man, we could have been friends years ago. Doesn't that suck? Isn't that stupid? And it's like, man, that's gonna hurt when they have to fight at the end of the day. So yeah, that's my theory. You might not like it. If you don't like it, or if you do like it as well, please tell me in the comments what you think the final prophecy says. I'm really interested in this, because this is one of those things where, honestly, there are so many potential answers, and it's just so difficult because it's so complicated. So I'm really interested in what you all have to say. Thank you for watching. My name is Spookydood, and I will see you next time.